I remember the taste of copper pennies in my mouth, and the sound of machines breathing for me when I first opened my eyes. The world came back in fragments, fluorescent lights that stabbed through my skull, the antiseptic smell that made my stomach lurch, and the crushing weight of 6 months stolen from my life. But nothing prepared me for the words that would shatter what remained of my 15-year-old world. Grace, honey, I need you to listen carefully. Doctor. Sarah Chen's voice was gentle, but I could hear the tremor beneath her professional composure. Her dark eyes, which I would later learn held more compassion than I'd ever known, searched my face as she delivered the blow that would define the rest of my life. Your parents. They signed away their parental rights 3 months ago. They're gone. Gone. Such a simple word for such a catastrophic reality. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. The ventilator had been removed only hours before, leaving my voice nothing more than a rasp. Where? I managed to croak. Dr. Chen's hands were warm as they folded around mine, and I would later realize this was the first genuine human touch I'd received since the accident. We don't know. They left no forwarding address, no contact information. The state has been looking for suitable placement for you, but... She paused, and I saw something fierce flash in her eyes. I've been fighting for temporary guardianship, if you'll have me. The machines around my bed continued their electronic symphony, marking time in a world that had fundamentally shifted while I slept. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last thing my parents had said to me. It was something mundane, probably about taking out the trash or finishing homework. How fitting that our final words had been so forgettable, so ordinary, when they were planning to erase me from their lives entirely. The accident itself was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and twisted metal. I'd been walking home from Emily Rodriguez's house after studying for our chemistry test. The drunk driver who hit me didn't stop. They found him 2 days later, passed out in a ditch 30 miles away. But he wasn't the one who abandoned me. He wasn't the one who looked at their broken daughter lying unconscious in a hospital bed and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Grace? Dr. Chen's voice pulled me back from the abyss of memory. What are you thinking? I opened my eyes and met her gaze. In the 3 months since I'd been unconscious, she'd been the only one fighting for me. She'd refused the hospital administration's recommendation to transfer me to a long-term care facility. She'd sat by my bed during her breaks, reading to my unresponsive body from medical journals and poetry collections alike. She'd been more of a parent to me while I was comatose than Helen and Robert Morrison had ever been while I was awake. Why? The word came out like a broken whistle. Why would you want a broken kid you barely know? Dr. Chen smiled then, and it transformed her entire face. Because someone needs to fight for you. Because you survived when the odds said you wouldn't. Because in 3 months of watching you breathe, I've seen more strength in your sleeping face than most people show while wide awake. I wanted to laugh, but it came out as a sob instead. Strength? I felt like tissue paper in a hurricane. Everything I'd thought I knew about my life, about love, about family, had been revealed as an elaborate lie. My parents hadn't even waited to see if I would wake up. They'd written me off like a bad investment and moved on with their lives. But as I looked at Dr. Chen, this stranger who had chosen to care when my own flesh and blood had chosen to flee, something began to crystallize in my chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Not yet. It was something harder and more valuable. It was determination. Okay, I whispered, but I want to know everything. I want to know exactly what they said when they signed those papers. I want to know if they asked about my condition. I want to know if they left anything. A letter, an explanation, anything. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. I have their file. But Grace, I need you to prepare yourself. Sometimes the truth is harder to bear than the mystery. I squeezed her hand with what little strength I had. I've already survived the worst thing I can imagine. They left me to die alone. Whatever their reasons were, whatever justifications they gave themselves, I need to know. Because someday, somehow, I'm going to make sure this never happens to another kid. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even realized I was thinking them. But as they hung in the air between us, I felt something shift inside my chest. The first foundation stone of who I would become had just been laid. Dr. Chen studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Then we'll start with the truth, and we'll build from there. Outside my window, rain began to fall, drumming against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. But for the first time in 3 months, I was awake to hear it. Dr. Sarah Chen lived in a house that felt like a sanctuary. Built in the 1920s, It had hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places and bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling in every room. When she brought me home from the hospital 2 weeks after I'd awakened, I felt like an intruder in someone else's life. "This is yours now," she said, opening the door to a sun-drenched room on the second floor. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and someone, Dr. Chen, I realized, had hung cheerful prints of flowers and birds. A desk sat beneath the window, and on it lay a stack of books, poetry, classics, and medical texts, side by side like old friends. I stood in the doorway, afraid to step inside. After 6 months in a sterile hospital room, the warmth felt overwhelming. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Dr. Chen sat on the edge of the bed, her expression serious. "Do you want the professional answer or the real one?" "The real one." She was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the maple tree whose branches nearly touched the glass. "When I was 12, my grandmother had a stroke. She lived with us for 2 years while she recovered, and I watched my mother care for her with this incredible tenderness. My grandmother couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't even feed herself. But my mother would sit with her every evening, brushing her hair and telling her about her day. She treated her with dignity when the rest of the world saw a burden. I finally stepped into the room, running my fingers along the smooth desktop. What happened to her? She recovered enough to live independently again. But what I learned from watching my mother was that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is refuse to give up on them. Your parents gave up, Grace. But I won't. The next few weeks passed in a haze of physical therapy appointments, legal meetings, and the strange domesticity of living with someone who actually cared whether I ate breakfast. Dr. Chen worked long shifts at the hospital, but she always came home with stories about her patients and questions about my day. She helped me with the schoolwork my new tutor brought, never growing frustrated when my concentration wandered or when simple math problems left me staring blankly at the page. "The brain injury affects your processing speed," she explained one evening as I struggled with a chemistry worksheet. "It's not that you're less intelligent. You just need to be patient with yourself." Patient. It was a word I was learning to live with. Patient with my body, which tired after walking to the mailbox. Patient with my memory, which had gaps and inconsistencies that made me feel like a stranger to myself. Patient with the legal system that was slowly, bureaucratically, dissolving the last official ties between me and the people who had raised me for 15 years. But it was the file that Dr. Chen eventually shared with me that tested my patience the most. She waited a month before showing it to me, until my physical therapy had progressed enough that I could walk without assistance, and my emotional equilibrium had stabilized to something resembling normal. We sat in her study on a rainy Thursday evening, the file between us on her mahogany desk like an unexploded bomb. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked. I nodded, though my hands were shaking. Inside the manila folder were the documents that would either provide closure or reopen wounds I was just learning to bandage. Dr. Chen opened it carefully, as if the papers inside might crumble at her touch. The abandonment forms were clinical, typed on state letterhead with official seals and witness signatures. But it was my mother's handwriting on the attached statement that made my breath catch in my throat. "We cannot provide the level of care that Grace will require. The medical expenses alone would bankrupt our family, and we have our other obligations to consider. We believe this decision is in everyone's best interest, including Grace's. Other obligations." I read the phrase 3 times before it sank in. They had chosen their mortgage, their car payments, their comfortable life over their daughter. I was an expense they couldn't afford, a liability they'd decided to write off. But it was the final paragraph that shattered something inside me. "We hope that Grace will understand that this decision comes from love, not abandonment. We want her to have the specialized care she deserves, care that we cannot provide." "Love," I whispered, the word tasting like poison. "They called it love." Dr. Chen reached across the desk and took my hand. "People tell themselves stories to live with their choices, Grace. That doesn't make those stories true." I looked up at her. This woman who had proven that love was actually showing up, fighting, refusing to walk away when things got difficult. Did they ever ask about my prognosis? Whether I might recover? Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. "They signed the papers the day after I told them you were showing increased brain activity. The day before, I recommended reducing your sedation to see if you would wake up." The room fell silent, except for the rain against the windows, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. My parents hadn't just abandoned a vegetable, a lost cause. They'd abandoned their daughter on the cusp of returning to them. "I'm going to be a lawyer," I said suddenly. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, from a place I didn't even know existed. I'm going to make sure kids like me have someone fighting for them. Dr. Chen smiled, and I saw pride shining in her eyes. Then we'd better get you caught up on your schoolwork. Harvard doesn't accept slackers. The first time I fell during physical therapy, I cried for 20 minutes, not from the pain of hitting the mat, but from the crushing realization that my body, which had once carried me through cross-country races and dance recitals, now betrayed me at every turn. My left leg dragged slightly when I walked, a constant reminder of the damage done during those 6 months of unconsciousness. My balance was shot, my reflexes dulled, and simple tasks like buttoning a shirt left me exhausted and frustrated. It's normal, my physical therapist Marcus Thompson assured me as I sat on the floor, tears streaming down my face. Your brain is rebuilding pathways that were damaged. It takes time. Marcus was in his 40s, with gentle brown eyes and the patience of a saint. He'd been working with brain injury patients for 15 years, and he had a way of pushing me just hard enough without breaking me completely. Unlike the parade of well-meaning visitors who spoke to me in carefully modulated tones, Marcus treated me like a whole person who happened to be temporarily broken. Tell me about before, he said, during one particularly difficult session, where I'd been trying to walk a straight line for the better part of an hour. What did you love to do? I stopped, swaying slightly as I fought to maintain my balance. I was going to be valedictorian. I had a 4.0 GPA, and I was planning to take 7 AP classes my junior year. I ran varsity cross-country, and Coach Martinez said I had a shot at a college scholarship if I kept improving my times. The words came out in a rush, and I realized it was the first time I'd talked about my old life without feeling like I was describing someone else entirely. That Grace, the one who existed before the accident, felt like a character from a book I'd read long ago. What else? Marcus prompted, adjusting the parallel bars I was gripping for support. I volunteered at the elementary school, helping kids with reading. There was this one boy, Tommy Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, who had dyslexia, and he was so frustrated with himself. His parents spoke limited English, and they couldn't help him with homework. I worked with him 3 afternoons a week for 2 years. I managed another step forward, concentrating on keeping my left foot from dragging. The last time I saw him, he'd just finished reading his first chapter book all by himself. He was so proud. Marcus smiled. Sounds like you've always been a fighter for people who needed an advocate. The observation hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of myself that way before, but he was right. Even before the accident, I'd been drawn to people who needed someone in their corner. It was why I'd chosen tutoring over more prestigious volunteer opportunities. It was why I'd spent my lunch periods helping the kids who ate alone. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do, I said, taking another careful step. Maybe everything that happened, the accident, my parents leaving, maybe it's preparing me for something. Marcus nodded approvingly. Your brain is rebuilding itself, Grace. Not just the damaged parts, but all of it. You get to decide who you want to be now. That night, I sat in my yellow bedroom at Dr. Chen's house, staring at the homework my tutor had left. Pre-calculus problems that would have taken me 20 minutes before the accident now required 2 hours of concentration. My handwriting, once precise and elegant, looked like a child's scrawl. But for the first time since waking up, I didn't feel sorry for myself. I thought about Tommy Chen, and how patient he'd been with himself as he struggled through sentences that came easily to other kids. I thought about Dr. Chen, who'd chosen to see potential where everyone else saw a lost cause. I thought about Marcus, who celebrated every small victory like it was a marathon finish. And I thought about my parents, who'd seen my broken body and decided it wasn't worth fixing. The next morning, I made a decision that would define everything that came after. Instead of letting Dr. Chen drive me to physical therapy, I asked if I could walk. It was only 6 blocks, but with my compromised balance and dragging left foot, it would take me nearly an hour. Are you sure? Dr. Chen asked, her forehead creased with concern. I need to know I can do it myself. She watched from the porch as I made my way down the sidewalk, my gait uneven but determined. Neighbors stared, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. But I kept walking, counting each step as a small victory over the people who'd decided I was too damaged to love. When I arrived at the rehabilitation center, sweat-soaked and trembling with exhaustion, Marcus was waiting with a towel and a bottle of water. How do you feel? He asked. Like I just ran a marathon, I gasped. Because you did, he said seriously. Every step you take is a marathon now, Grace. The question is whether you're going to keep running. I looked at him through the glass doors of the center, at the other patients working with their therapists, at the motivational posters that proclaimed things like progress, not perfection, and every journey begins with a single step. I'm going to keep running, I said. But now I'm running toward something. The law books in Dr. Chen's study called to me like sirens. While she worked late shifts at the hospital, I would sit in her leather chair, surrounded by volumes on medical ethics, patient rights, and healthcare law. What started as idle curiosity became an obsession that consumed my evenings and weekends. Interesting reading choice, Dr. Chen commented one night, finding me hunched over a thick tome titled Pediatric Medical Decision-Making and Parental Rights. It was nearly midnight, and I'd been reading for 4 hours straight, my injured brain processing the complex legal language with surprising clarity. I'm trying to understand how it's legal, I said without looking up, how parents can just discard their children when they become inconvenient. Dr. Chen settled into the chair across from me, still wearing her scrubs from the hospital. What have you learned? I marked my place with a finger and looked at her. That the system is designed to protect parental rights, even when parents don't deserve them. That children like me, the ones who become disabled or require expensive medical care, can be abandoned legally as long as the proper paperwork is filed. That there are thousands of kids in the system right now whose parents made the same choice mine did. The words came out bitter, but underneath the anger was something else. Determination. Each case study I read, each legal precedent I discovered, added fuel to a fire that had been building in my chest since the day I woke up alone in that hospital bed. There's a case here from 2018, I continued, flipping through pages covered with my careful notes. A 9-year-old boy with cerebral palsy. His parents surrendered custody to the state because they couldn't afford his medical care, and the state wouldn't provide adequate support services. He lived in institutions for 3 years before a family finally adopted him. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. What happened to him? He's thriving now. Honor roll student, plays adaptive sports, has a family that actually fights for him. But those 3 years in the system, I shook my head. 3 years of believing he wasn't worth loving. I'd been having nightmares about that boy, about all the children whose stories filled these legal texts. I'd wake up in my yellow bedroom, heart pounding, imagining myself at 9 years old instead of 15, too young to understand why my parents had walked away. Is this healthy for you? Dr. Chen asked gently, reading about so much pain. I closed the book and met her eyes. Is it healthy for those kids to live it? She was quiet for a moment, studying my face. You know, when I was in medical school, I thought I wanted to be a surgeon. All the prestige, the dramatic life-saving procedures. But during my pediatric rotation, I met a little girl who'd been born with spina bifida. Her parents were young, overwhelmed, talking about giving her up because they couldn't handle the medical complexity. What did you do? I spent 3 weeks teaching them everything I could about her condition, connecting them with support groups, helping them navigate insurance and social services. When I left that rotation, they decided to keep fighting for her. Dr. Chen smiled. That's when I knew I wanted to specialize in pediatric neurology. Not because of the dramatic saves, but because of the families I could help keep together. I opened the book again, finding the page I'd been studying. This case, Williams v. State of California, it establishes precedent that children have a right to legal representation in abandonment proceedings, even if they're too young or incapacitated to request it themselves. You're thinking like a lawyer, Dr. Chen observed. I'm thinking like someone who needed a lawyer and didn't have one. I turned the page, revealing more highlighted passages and margin notes. When my parents signed those papers, I was unconscious. I had no advocate, no one questioning whether this was really in my best interest or just convenient for them. The truth was, the law books were the first things that had made sense to me since the accident. While my brain struggled with math and science, legal concepts clicked into place with startling clarity. I could see the patterns, the loopholes, the places where the system failed the most vulnerable people it was supposed to protect. Marcus had been right. My brain was rebuilding itself, and this was apparently what it wanted to become. Not the pre-med track I'd planned before the accident, but something that would let me fight for kids like Tommy Chen, like the boy with cerebral palsy, like the 15-year-old girl I'd been when she needed someone most. Dr. Chen, I said, looking up from the book with a clarity I hadn't felt since before the accident. I want to take the SATs early. I want to apply to colleges with strong pre-law programs. I want to specialize in family law and children's rights. She smiled, and I saw pride and something else. Relief, maybe, flash across her face. Then we'd better start preparing. Harvard Law School has very high standards. Good, I said, turning back to my book. So do I. That night, I dreamed not of abandonment or broken bodies, but of courtrooms where I stood as an advocate for children who had no voice. In my dream, I wore a black robe and spoke with authority about justice and protection, and the sacred duty of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. When I woke, I could still feel the weight of that imaginary robe on my shoulders. Senior year of high school arrived like a sprint toward an impossible finish line. While my classmates worried about prom and senior pranks, I was consumed by a singular focus: getting into college with enough scholarship money to pay for both undergraduate and law school. Dr. Chen had offered to help financially, but I was determined to make my own way. My parents had written me off as a liability. I would prove them catastrophically wrong. Your transcript is extraordinary, Ms. Patricia Williams, my guidance counselor, said during our meeting in early September. She spread my academic records across her desk like she was laying out tarot cards that predicted an uncertain future. 4.0 GPA, perfect attendance since returning to school, volunteer work at the legal aid clinic, and these SAT scores. She whistled softly. 1580 out of 1600. Grace, you could get into anywhere. I shifted in my chair, trying to ignore the way my left leg had begun to ache from sitting too long. The physical effects of my brain injury had improved dramatically, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. I still tired more easily than my peers, still had days when my balance was off or my concentration wavered, but I'd learned to work around my limitations rather than surrender to them. I need merit scholarships, I said. Full rides, if possible. I want to apply to 15 schools. Ms. Williams raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious and expensive. Application fees alone would cost over $1,000. I've been working weekends at the law office downtown, filing, answering phones, whatever they need. I've saved enough for applications, and I've gotten fee waivers for 5 of them based on income eligibility. I pulled out a folder thick with application materials I'd been organizing for months. I've already started the essays. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been working 20 hours a week on top of my full course load, that I often studied until 2 a.m, that I'd given up every social activity except the volunteer work that would strengthen my law school applications. My classmates had grown tired of inviting me to parties I never attended, dates I always declined. They thought I was antisocial. They had no idea I was preparing for war. The essay prompts had been brutal in their demand for vulnerability. Describe a challenge you've overcome and how it shaped your character. Tell us about a time when you advocated for someone else. What experiences have led you to pursue a career in law? I wrote 17 drafts of my personal statement before I was satisfied. The final version began. When I woke up from a 6-month coma to discover my parents had abandoned me, I learned that the legal system designed to protect children had failed completely in my case. This failure became my calling. Dr. Chen read every draft, offering gentle suggestions and unwavering encouragement. "You're not asking them to pity you," she said, after reading the final version. "You're showing them your strength." That's exactly right. But it was Marcus, my former physical therapist who had become something like a big brother, who gave me the advice that changed everything. I'd been agonizing over whether to mention my ongoing physical limitations in my applications. "Don't hide from who you are," he said, as we sat in a coffee shop near the rehabilitation center, where we still met monthly to check on my progress. "You're not damaged goods trying to pass as normal. You're someone who has faced extraordinary challenges and emerged stronger. That's not a liability in law. That's an asset." He was right. My disability hadn't made me weak. It had made me empathetic. My abandonment hadn't broken me. It had given me purpose. The medical bills and legal complications I'd navigated with Dr. Chen's help hadn't been obstacles. They'd been education. I rewrote sections of my applications to reflect this perspective, describing how my experience as a patient had taught me about healthcare law, how advocating for my own educational accommodations had introduced me to disability rights, how volunteering at legal aid had shown me the gap between legal protection and actual justice. The acceptances started arriving in March. Georgetown, with a partial scholarship. Northwestern, with a merit award that covered tuition. Duke, with a full ride. But it was the letter from Harvard that made my hands shake as I opened it. "Dear Grace," I read aloud to Dr. Chen, my voice barely steady. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Harvard University with a full 4-year scholarship through the Presidential Scholars Program." Dr. Chen pulled me into a hug that nearly knocked us both over. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, and I realized she was crying. That night, I called Marcus to share the news, then sat alone in my yellow bedroom, holding the Harvard acceptance letter. I thought about the girl who had awakened from a coma 2 years ago, broken and alone, and convinced she was worthless. I thought about my parents, wherever they were, and wondered if they ever thought about the daughter they'd discarded. But mostly, I thought about the future. 4 years at Harvard, then 3 years at Harvard Law School, if I could maintain my grades. 7 years to transform myself from an abandoned girl into someone with the power to protect other abandoned children. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the filing system I'd been maintaining since sophomore year. Applications, transcripts, recommendation letters, all organized with the precision that would serve me well in law school. Phase 1 complete, I whispered to my reflection in the window. Phase 2 begins now. Harvard Law School was a cathedral of ambition, its red brick buildings and ivy-covered walls housing some of the sharpest minds in the country. Walking through the courtyard on my first day, I felt the weight of imposter syndrome settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Everyone around me seemed to belong here in a way I wasn't sure I did. Polished, confident, speaking in casual references to famous cases and legal theories I was only beginning to understand. But it was in Professor Elena Rodriguez's family law seminar that I found my footing. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she had a reputation for destroying unprepared students with surgical precision. On the third day of class, she called on me to discuss Santosky v. Kramer, a Supreme Court case about terminating parental rights. "Ms. Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the nervous energy in the lecture hall, "tell us about the standard of proof required for involuntary termination of parental rights." I stood, my heart hammering against my ribs. Around me, 50 of the brightest law students in the country waited to see if I would crumble under pressure. The court held that the Due Process Clause requires at least clear and convincing evidence before a state may sever completely and irrevocably the rights of parents in their natural child. And what's the significance of that standard? I took a breath, thinking not just about the legal precedent, but about the 15-year-old girl lying unconscious, while her parents signed papers that erased her from their lives. It's supposed to protect the fundamental right of family integrity, but it also creates a paradox. While we require clear and convincing evidence to forcibly separate children from unfit parents, we allow parents to voluntarily abandon children with far less scrutiny. Professor Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain." "My parents surrendered their parental rights to me when I was in a coma, claiming they couldn't provide adequate care. No one investigated whether that was actually true, whether there were resources available to help them, or whether their decision was truly in my best interest rather than just convenient for them. The system that's designed to be so protective of parental rights when the state wants to intervene becomes remarkably permissive when parents want to walk away." The lecture hall was completely silent. I could feel the stares of my classmates, some skeptical, others curious. Professor Rodriguez studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That's an astute observation, Ms. Morrison. Perhaps you'd be interested in some additional reading on voluntary relinquishment standards across different jurisdictions." After class, she handed me a stack of law review articles and case studies that would consume my evenings for the next month. But it was the conversation we had in her office 2 weeks later that changed the trajectory of my legal education. "I've been reviewing your application materials," she said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the worn leather chairs across from her desk. "Your personal statement mentioned your experience with parental abandonment." I nodded, suddenly wary. I'd learned that sharing my story could generate either sympathy or skepticism, and I wasn't sure which would be worse in this context. "I want to offer you a position as my research assistant," Professor Rodriguez continued. "I'm working on a comprehensive study of voluntary relinquishment laws and their outcomes for children. Your perspective would be invaluable." The research position opened doors I hadn't even known existed. I spent my second year diving deep into family law databases, tracking outcomes for children who had been voluntarily relinquished by their parents. The statistics were staggering. Kids who entered the system through voluntary abandonment were less likely to be adopted, more likely to age out of foster care, and significantly more likely to experience educational and social difficulties. But it was the individual cases that kept me awake at night. Sarah, age 7, given up by parents who couldn't afford her diabetes medication. Miguel, age 4, surrendered when his developmental delays became too difficult to manage. Jennifer, age 12, relinquished after her parents divorced, and neither wanted custody. "You're taking this personally," warned David Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, my study partner and closest friend at law school. We were sitting in the library at 2 a.m, surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups. "You can't save every kid who's been abandoned." "I'm not trying to save every kid," I replied, highlighting another passage about inadequate legal representation for children in family court. "I'm trying to fix a system that's broken." David looked up from his constitutional law textbook. "What's your end game here, Grace? You graduate, work at a big firm, make partner, and then what? Pro bono work on weekends?" I set down my highlighter and met his eyes. "I want to be a judge, family court. I want to be the person making decisions about whether parents' rights should be terminated, whether children should be removed from homes, whether voluntary relinquishments are actually in kids' best interests. That's a 20-year plan minimum. You need to practice law first, build a reputation, get appointed or elected. Then I better start now." My final paper for Professor Rodriguez's seminar was titled Reforming Voluntary Relinquishment, a Framework for Child-Centered Decision-Making. It was 57 pages of research, legal analysis, and policy recommendations that would later be published in the Harvard Law Review. But more importantly, it was my declaration of war against a system that had failed me and continued to fail thousands of children every year. "This is sophisticated work," Professor Rodriguez told me, as she handed back my graded paper with an A+ written in red ink across the top. "Have you considered an academic career?" I shook my head. "I want to be in the courtroom, making decisions that matter. I want to be the last line of defense for kids who don't have anyone else fighting for them." She smiled, and I saw something that looked like pride in her eyes. "Then you'd better be prepared to fight harder than you've ever fought before. The bench isn't given to people like us. It's earned. 10 years of grinding. 10 years of 18-hour days, high-profile cases, and building a reputation as the lawyer you called when everything else had failed. 10 years of proving that the abandoned girl from the hospital bed had become someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed." And now, at 32, I was standing in the chambers of the Honorable Judge Patricia Winters, waiting to be sworn in as the youngest family court judge in the state. "Are you ready for this?" Judge Winters asked, adjusting the black robe that would soon be mine. She was retiring after 25 years on the bench, and she'd personally recommended me for the appointment. Family court isn't like other judicial assignments. Every decision you make changes someone's life forever. I thought about the path that had led me here. After Harvard Law, I'd clerked for Judge Maria Santos in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, learning how the highest levels of jurisprudence functioned. Then 5 years at the Public Defender's Office, representing parents and children in some of the most heartbreaking cases imaginable. Then 5 more years in private practice, building a reputation as a fierce advocate for children's rights. The appointment had come suddenly. Governor Martinez had called me personally, explaining that she wanted someone on the family court bench who understood the system from the ground up, someone who had personal experience with what was at stake in these proceedings. "I need someone who won't just follow precedent," she'd said during our interview. "I need someone who will ask the hard questions, who will look beyond the paperwork to see the actual children affected by these decisions." Now standing in Judge Winters' chambers, I felt the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders. The woman who had once been powerless in the face of legal abandonment was about to become the person making those decisions for other children. "I'm ready," I told Judge Winters, though my hands were shaking slightly as I said it. The swearing-in ceremony was small. Dr. Chen, Marcus, a few colleagues from my law firm, and Professor Rodriguez, who had flown in from Harvard for the occasion. As I raised my right hand and repeated the judicial oath, I caught Dr. Chen's eye. She was crying, and I realized I was too. "Congratulations, Your Honor," Judge Winters said, shaking my hand after the ceremony concluded. "The chambers are yours now." My first day on the bench was a disaster. I was so nervous that I knocked over my water glass during the first hearing, and I stumbled over basic procedural language that I'd known by heart for years. But by the third case of the day, a custody dispute involving a 7-year-old girl, whose parents were more interested in hurting each other than protecting their daughter, I found my rhythm. "Mr. Patterson," I said to the father's attorney, "your client's proposal would have this child changing schools 3 times in one academic year, just to accommodate his work schedule. How exactly does that serve her best interests?" The attorney fumbled through an answer about paternal rights and equal custody time, but I could see through the legal language to what this really was. 2 adults using their child as a weapon in their personal war. "Ms. Chen?" I addressed the court-appointed guardian ad litem, whose name, coincidentally, was also Chen, though she was no relation to Dr. Chen. "What is your recommendation based on your interview with the child?" "Your Honor, Emma told me she just wants to stay in one place long enough to make friends. She's been bounced between households for 2 years, and she's struggling academically and socially." I looked at both parents, seeing the anger and hurt in their faces, but also the genuine love they had for their daughter. "I'm ordering a 6-month trial period, where Emma remains in the family home and both parents rotate in and out based on a fixed schedule. She keeps her school, her routine, her stability. You two figure out how to put her needs ahead of your feelings. We'll reconvene in 6 months to assess how it's working." The parents' attorneys both started to object, but I held up my hand. "This isn't about your rights as parents. It's about her rights as a child." Court adjourned. After they left, I sat alone in my chambers, staring at the gavel in my hands. It felt heavy, weighted with all the decisions yet to come. On my desk was a photo Dr. Chen had given me, a picture of us on my Harvard graduation day, both of us grinning despite the rain that had soaked our graduation clothes. That night, I went home to my small apartment and called Dr. Chen. "How did it feel?" she asked. "Terrifying, overwhelming, like I might finally be doing what I'm supposed to be doing." "Good," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "If it felt easy, you'd be doing it wrong." Over the following months, I settled into the rhythm of the bench. My docket was filled with the kinds of cases that kept me awake at night. Children removed from abusive homes, parents fighting for custody they hadn't earned, families torn apart by addiction and mental illness and poverty. But there were victories, too. Adoptions that created forever families, reunifications that proved people could change, protective orders that kept children safe. I became known for asking unconventional questions, for looking beyond the legal arguments to the human impact of my decisions. My former colleagues started calling me Judge Grace, with a mixture of respect and affection, and I discovered that the title felt right in a way that surprised me. But it was the abandonment cases that tested me most. Every time parents voluntarily surrendered their rights, I thought about 15-year-old me lying unconscious while my fate was decided without my input. I instituted new procedures, mandatory counseling, resource assessments, cooling-off periods. I wanted to be sure that these decisions were truly in the children's best interests, not just convenient for overwhelmed parents. 3 years into my tenure, my reputation was solid. I was fair but firm, compassionate but clear-eyed about difficult realities. I'd handled over 2,000 cases, and my decisions were rarely overturned on appeal. I was exactly where I'd dreamed of being since that first night in Dr. Chen's study, reading about legal failures and systemic gaps. And then, on a routine Tuesday morning in October, my past walked into my courtroom. The October morning started like any other. I was reviewing case files in my chambers when my clerk, Janet, knocked on the door. "Your Honor, we have a new emergency custody hearing. The Morrison's attorney just filed this morning." I looked up from the dependency case I'd been studying. "Morrison? That's not on my docket. Judge Harrison had to recuse himself. Family connection to one of the attorneys. They're asking for an immediate temporary restraining order to prevent the father from taking their 5-year-old daughter out of state." I nodded, setting aside my other files. Emergency custody hearings were routine in family court, though they were often the most emotionally charged proceedings on my calendar. "How long do I have to review the petition?" 30 minutes. Both parties are already here with their attorneys." I took the file and began reading, my trained eye scanning for the crucial details that would guide my decision. Helen Morrison v. Robert Morrison. Petitioner seeks emergency custody order preventing respondent from exercising court-ordered visitation due to credible threats to relocate minor child out of jurisdiction. Morrison. The name was common enough that it barely registered consciously, though something stirred uneasily in my chest. I continued reading. Parties married 2019, divorced 2023. One minor child, Lily Morrison, age 5. The petition painted a picture I'd seen dozens of times before. A bitter divorce followed by an equally bitter custody battle, with accusations of parental alienation flying in both directions. The mother claimed the father was planning to take their daughter to his sister's house in Oregon and never return. The father's counterfiling accused the mother of making false allegations to restrict his parental rights. I made my notes, put on my robe, and entered the courtroom. My bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, announced my entry with the familiar, "All rise. This court is now in session." The Honorable Judge Grace Morrison presiding. I took my seat at the bench, adjusted my glasses, and looked down at the party's table. Please be seated. This is the matter of Morrison versus Morrison, case number FC 2025-1847. Counsel, please state your appearances for the record. Jennifer Walsh for the petitioner, Helen Morrison, Your Honor. Michael Brady for the respondent, Robert Morrison, Your Honor. I looked up from my notes to get my first view of the parties, a routine assessment that would help me gauge their demeanor and credibility as the hearing proceeded. The woman at the petitioner's table was slender, blonde, wearing a navy business suit that suggested professional success. She looked to be in her early 40s, and she was gripping her attorney's arm with white-knuckled intensity. But it was when I shifted my gaze to the respondent's table that the world tilted off its axis. The man sitting next to the defense attorney had thinning brown hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a gray suit that had seen better days, and he was nervously adjusting his tie as he waited for the hearing to begin. He looked older than his 50-something years, worn down by what appeared to be a contentious divorce and custody battle. I would have recognized him anywhere. He was my father, Robert Morrison, the man who had signed papers 17 years ago, surrendering his parental rights to his brain-injured daughter because she had become too expensive, too complicated, too inconvenient to love. The file fell from my numb fingers, scattering papers across my bench. Janet immediately moved to collect them, but I barely noticed. The courtroom seemed to be spinning around me, the familiar sounds of legal proceedings fading into white noise. He hadn't seen me yet. His attention was focused on his attorney, who was whispering something urgent in his ear. But I could see him clearly, this man who had haunted my nightmares and fueled my ambitions for nearly 2 decades. He looked tired, defeated, nothing like the monster I'd constructed in my imagination. And beside him, in the gallery section behind the party's table, sat a woman I recognized just as immediately. Helen Morrison, not his ex-wife, but his current wife. My stepmother, though she'd never claimed that title. The woman who had stood by and watched while her husband abandoned his injured daughter. My mother. They'd remarried each other. The parents who had discarded me had found their way back together, and now they were fighting over the custody of another child. A 5-year-old girl named Lily Morrison, who was their daughter, which made her my half-sister. Your Honor? Attorney Walsh's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you ready to proceed? I gripped the edge of my bench, trying to steady myself. 17 years of preparation, of building toward this moment without ever imagining it would actually come, and I was completely unprepared for the reality of seeing them again. My father still hadn't looked up at me. He was reading through documents, occasionally nodding at something his attorney pointed out. But my mother, Helen, was staring directly at me with a puzzled expression, as if she almost recognized something familiar, but couldn't quite place it. And then, slowly, her face went white as understanding dawned. Your Honor, Attorney Brady said, rising from his chair. My client would like to... That's when my father looked up. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I watched as 17 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. His face went through the same transformation as Helen's. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like terror. I saw his mouth form a single silent word. Grace. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound I could hear the old building settling around us. My father, Robert Morrison, stared at me with growing horror as the implications of the situation became clear. Helen had gone sheet white and was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. Even their attorneys seemed to sense something had shifted dramatically, though they couldn't understand what. Your Honor, Attorney Walsh said hesitantly, perhaps we could take a brief recess. I needed to recuse myself. Every principle of judicial ethics demanded it. A judge cannot preside over a case involving family members, and despite their legal abandonment of me 17 years ago, these people were technically still my biological parents. The proper thing, the only legal thing, was to step down and transfer the case to another judge. But looking at them sitting there, these people who had signed papers declaring me too damaged to love, something fierce and uncompromising rose in my chest. They were here seeking the court's protection for their new child, the daughter they'd kept when they'd thrown me away. They wanted justice from a system they'd exploited when it suited them. Motion to recuse denied, I heard myself say. We will proceed with the hearing. Both attorneys looked startled. Helen whispered something urgent to her lawyer, who stood slowly. Your Honor, my client would like to request a continuance to... Request denied. This is an emergency custody hearing regarding the welfare of a 5-year-old child. We will not delay justice because the parties are uncomfortable with their assigned judge. I looked directly at my parents for the first time since recognizing them. Unless either party has specific cause to challenge my ability to rule fairly on this matter, the question hung in the air like a challenge. What could they say? That they'd abandoned their previous daughter and didn't trust her to be impartial? That they were afraid their past would influence my decision? Admitting either would be admitting to actions they'd spent 17 years trying to forget. Robert, I couldn't think of him as Dad, or even my father anymore, whispered frantically to his attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. No objections, Your Honor, Attorney Brady finally said, though his voice was strained. Excellent. Ms. Walsh, please present your client's petition. Attorney Walsh stood, consulting her notes with hands that trembled slightly. Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison seeks an emergency restraining order preventing Mr. Andgein Morrison from exercising his scheduled visitation this weekend. She has credible evidence that he intends to take their daughter Lily to Oregon and not return her. I made notes as she spoke, my hands steady despite the emotional tornado raging inside me. What evidence? Text messages from Mr. Morrison's sister, airline tickets purchased for this Friday, and suspicious behavior including the respondent asking the child's school for copies of her academic records. I looked at Robert's attorney. Mr. Brady, your response? Your Honor, my client has every right to travel with his daughter during his court-ordered visitation time. He's planning a visit to his sister's house for the weekend, nothing more. Mrs. Morrison is using these false allegations to restrict his parental rights. I see. I leaned back in my chair, studying both parents. Helen kept darting glances at me, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Robert stared determinedly at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Mr. Morrison, please stand. He rose on unsteady legs, his face pale. This was the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had attended my elementary school plays, who had tucked me into bed every night until I was 8, and decided I was too old for such things. This was also the man who had looked at my broken body in a hospital bed, and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Mr. Morrison, do you understand the serious nature of these allegations? Yes, Your Honor. His voice was barely a whisper. And do you understand that violating a custody order by taking a child out of jurisdiction without permission is a felony? Yes, Your Honor. I studied his face, looking for signs of the father I'd once loved, once trusted to protect me. But all I saw was a tired, defeated man who seemed to make the same mistakes over and over again. Mrs. Morrison, please stand. Helen rose, her legs visibly shaking. She was smaller than I remembered, more fragile. When I was 15, she'd seemed like an adult with all the power in the world. Now she looked like what she was, a middle-aged woman terrified of losing another child. Mrs. Morrison, what assurances can you give this court that you're not using these allegations to manipulate the custody arrangement? She stopped, looking at me with something that might have been recognition of the woman I'd become. I just want to protect my daughter, Your Honor. I want to make sure she's safe. Your daughter. I repeated the phrase slowly, letting it hang in the air. And what makes you think Mr. Morrison would harm her? Helen's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. He has a history of abandoning his responsibilities when things get difficult. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Robert's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the hearing began. In that moment, I saw that he knew exactly what Helen had just implied, and he knew that I understood it too. I see. I made another note, my handwriting perfectly controlled despite the rage building in my chest. And you, Mr. Morrison, do you have a history of abandoning your responsibilities when they become inconvenient? He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with how to answer. To deny it would be a lie that we all knew was a lie. To admit it would be damaging to his custody case, and devastating to whatever conscience he still possessed. Your Honor, Attorney Brady interjected, I don't see how this line of questioning is relevant to— I'll determine relevance, counsel. I never took my eyes off Robert. Mr. Morrison, I'm waiting for your answer. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. I've made mistakes, Your Honor. Serious mistakes. But I love my daughter, and I would never hurt her. Which daughter would that be, Mr. Morrison? The question fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would change everything that came after. The silence that followed my question seemed to last for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Robert Morrison stood frozen at the defendant's table, his face cycling through expressions of shame, recognition, and something that might have been regret. Helen had sunk back into her chair, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if she could somehow take back the words that had opened this Pandora's box. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 17 years of preparation for this moment, "I believe I asked you a question. Which daughter do you love and would never hurt?" His attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. It's not relevant to the custody matter at hand and seems designed to..." Overruled. I didn't look away from Robert. The question stands. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Around the courtroom, I could feel the tension building as the other attorneys and court personnel sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, even if they didn't understand what. Finally, he found his voice. "Both," he whispered. "I love both my daughters. Both." I made a note on my pad, though my handwriting was becoming less steady. "And yet one of those daughters you signed away when she needed you most. One of those daughters you abandoned when her medical bills became too expensive. One of those daughters woke up from a coma to discover that her parents, both of you, had decided she wasn't worth the inconvenience." Helen was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. But she wasn't the broken woman I'd imagined in my worst nightmares. She looked smaller, more human, more fragile than the monster who had haunted my adolescent rage. "Your Honor," Attorney Walsh said carefully, "perhaps we should take a recess to..." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "This court will hear the truth, all of it." I looked directly at Helen. "Mrs. Morrison, do you recognize your judge?" She nodded slowly, unable to speak. "Please state for the record who I am." Her voice broke. "Your Grace, our daughter, our first daughter." The court reporter's fingers stopped moving across her stenotype machine. My bailiff shifted uncomfortably by the door. The attorneys stared at me with dawning understanding of the impossible situation unfolding before them. "The daughter you abandoned," I corrected. "The daughter you wrote off as too expensive to love. The daughter who spent 6 months in a coma while you decided her life wasn't worth the effort required to maintain it." "Grace?" Robert said, and hearing my name in his voice after 17 years hit me like a physical blow. "You don't understand." I understand perfectly." I opened the file in front of me, pulling out a document I'd memorized long ago. "I have your surrender papers right here. Would you like me to read your statement to the court? The one where you claimed this decision came from love?" I watched him crumble. This man who had once been my hero. "We were scared," he whispered. "The doctors said you might never wake up. The bills were crushing us. You thought wrong." I set the papers aside and looked at both of them. These people who had shaped my life through their absence more than they'd ever shaped it through their presence. "But this hearing isn't about your failures as parents 17 years ago. This hearing is about whether you're fit to parent the child you kept." I turned to Lily's court-appointed guardian ad litem, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout this exchange. "Ms. Peterson, what are your observations about the child in question?" She cleared her throat, clearly struggling to process what she'd just witnessed. "Your Honor, 5-year-old Lily Morrison appears to be a healthy, well-adjusted child who loves both her parents. However, she's shown signs of anxiety related to their ongoing conflict. And what is your recommendation regarding the emergency custody order?" Ms. Peterson glanced at both parents before answering. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented and the complexity of the family dynamics, I recommend supervised visitation pending a full custody evaluation." I nodded, making notes. Around me, the familiar machinery of family court continued to function, even as my personal world tilted on its axis. This was what I'd trained for, the ability to separate my emotions from my judicial duty, to make decisions based on law and evidence rather than personal history. But then I looked at the photograph in the case file, a school picture of a 5-year-old girl with brown hair and serious eyes. She looked like I had at that age, before everything went wrong. She looked like a child who deserved better than parents who ran away when things got difficult. "Here's my ruling," I said, and my voice carried all the authority I'd spent 17 years earning. "The emergency restraining order is granted with modifications. Mr. Morrison, you will have supervised visitation with your daughter every other weekend, supervised by a court-appointed monitor. You will not take her out of state without written permission from this court. Both parties will undergo immediate family counseling, both individually and together, to address the communication issues that are harming this child." I paused, looking directly at both of them. "Furthermore, both parties will be required to participate in parenting classes focused on putting children's needs ahead of adult conflicts, because I've seen what happens when parents decide their own convenience matters more than their children's welfare." Helen was sobbing openly now, and Robert looked like he might collapse. But most importantly, I continued, you will both remember that being a parent is not a convenience or a right to be exercised when it suits you. It's a responsibility that doesn't end when things get difficult or expensive or complicated. It's a sacred trust that you've already violated once. I gathered my papers, my hands finally steady. This court will monitor your progress closely, and any violation of these orders will result in immediate termination of visitation rights. Court is adjourned. As I stood to leave, Robert found his voice one last time. Grace, please. Can we talk? I paused at the door to my chambers, looking back at this man who had given me life and then abandoned it when it became inconvenient. Mr. Morrison, anything you wish to communicate to this court can be done through proper legal channels. I suggest you focus on being the father to Lily that you should have been to me. I left them there in my courtroom, these ghosts from my past who had somehow become real again. In my chambers, I sat at my desk and stared at the photograph Dr. Chen had given me, the one of us at my Harvard graduation, both of us soaked and grinning despite the rain. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. Dinner tonight? I made your favorite stir-fry. I smiled, typing back. Yes, I have a story to tell you. Outside my window, the autumn sun was setting over the courthouse where I'd spent 3 years fighting for children who needed someone in their corner. Tomorrow there would be more cases, more families in crisis, more children who needed protection from adults who had failed them. But tonight, I was going home to the woman who had chosen to love me when my own parents had chosen to leave, home to the family I'd built from the ashes of the one that had abandoned me. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about protection. And sometimes it was about proving that love could triumph over abandonment, that chosen family could be stronger than biological bonds, and that the children society discards can grow up to become the guardians of other discarded children. I was Grace Morrison, the abandoned daughter who had become a protector of the abandoned. And that was exactly who I was meant to be.